and thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me all right with the mics? So I'm just going to talk a little bit, and then I'll read just a little tiny bit from the book so you have a sense of what the book itself is actually like. So when I used to tell people that I was writing a book called Invisible Hands, a pretty common response I got was, oh, you're writing about the vast right-wing conspiracy. And I would usually say, no, the reason the book is called Invisible Hands is, well, first of all, it's a kind of pun on Adam Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand. The idea that by stepping aside and letting the free interaction of individuals in the marketplace determine the course of social life, that we can have the best possible outcomes for everybody. But in fact, I suggested that part of the reason this idea of the market is so widespread in American culture and politics today isn't because it spontaneously caught on, but is because of it was promoted in a self-conscious way by a group of people who sought to kind of push it forwards and push it into the mainstream of American life. The book is about kind of things happening behind the scenes. It's a book about the conservative movement, which doesn't just look at the public figureheads of the right, William F. Buckley to Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan, although all of those figures do appear in the book. But the book is really about the people who financed them, who backed them, supported them, and the kind of milieu that they emerged out of. So I began writing this book in the early part of the decade. And like many people, I wanted to understand kind of where the strength of conservative politics came from. And not just, I started writing it not long after Bush was elected for the first time, but it wasn't just the Bush administration that I was interested in. I wanted to understand kind of where the faith in free trade and tax cuts came from, what the origins of the shocking increase in economic inequality in the country were, why the labor movement, which was so strong in the middle of the 20th century, how it had become so weakened over time, and kind of why the social safety net was being rolled back, and most of all, kind of where this faith in the free market came from as a solution to all kinds of social problems ranging from poverty to environmental degradation. And I think, given the economic events, especially of the last few months, we're starting to see a kind of rebirth of skepticism towards the idea of deregulation and the market. But we can talk more about that later. What was mysterious to me, though, about most historical writing on the conservative movement is that it barely dealt with these economic issues at all. Most history books about conservatism really focus on the backlash against the social movements of the 60s, on the white working class reacting against the successes of the civil rights movement, feminism, gay and lesbian rights, and the anti-war movement. The central battles are from the 70s, kind of the riot of construction workers against anti-war protesters on Wall Street, the idea of the silent majority, the white parents who boycotted school busing. And implicit in all of this, I think, is the idea that the New Left kind of went too far, was too radical, and that it alienated the people who had once formed the basis of support for liberalism. Today, in a lot of ways, we find the same emphasis in the press on what the conservative movement is, seeing it as a movement of conservative Christians, pro-life activists, really galvanized by social issues. And I think this history is important, and it's a big part of the story, but it doesn't tell us everything, because it can't make sense of where the economic agenda comes from. It can't make sense of kind of tax cuts, opposition to unions, the glorification of the free market. Is this politics really coming from this social conservative backlash or from religious traditionalists? And in some ways, it's even more puzzling because many history books paint the post-war period as a time of peace between business and labor, when companies accepted the prerogatives of unions and of the liberal state without that much protest. So if that's the case, where did this come from? Where did this kind of economic politics emerge? And I began to wonder, what if you studied the conservative movement, but you started someplace else? What if you tried to understand the origins of conservative politics, not by focusing primarily on election campaigns and why people voted as they did, but if you looked instead at the creation of its economic politics? What if you actually looked at what business and business organizations were doing throughout the period? How would this change your story? And so that's kind of what I set out to do. And I did research in archives kind of all over the country, everywhere from the papers of the National Association of Manufacturers, which are in kind of an old DuPont factory on the outskirts of Wilmington, Delaware, to the papers of the Business Roundtable here in DC, which they generously let me use, to the Bob Jones University papers, and the Jesse Helms Center for Free Enterprise, which is this weird kind of gigantic structure in a sort of colonial style in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina, just kind of rising up out of the tobacco fields. And through this work, what I found is that there was, in fact, a kind of network of business activists from a range of different kinds of companies who remained deeply opposed to the New Deal and to labor unions and liberalism throughout long after the 1930s, during the years when people thought that the kind of New Deal order had been entirely accepted, and that their work helped to create many of the ideas and conservative movement institutions that are still around today. So, for a couple of examples of this, in the 1950s, men like Jasper Crane of DuPont had been one of the kind of companies most active in actually fighting the New Deal during the 30s, helping fund and found the American Liberty League, one of the earliest anti-New Deal organizations. Crane, at the end of World War II, became involved in raising money for Friedrich von Hayek, an Austrian economist at the University of Chicago, whose salary was actually also paid by a business conservative who arranged for him to come to Chicago in a lot of ways. But Crane became involved in raising money for Hayek and his kind of intellectual project of, Hayek was in the process of organizing a kind of group of like-minded intellectuals to advance the idea of the market. And Crane was desperate to revive a kind of faith in the idea of the market. One very interesting thing about these businessmen in the early post-war period is just how concerned they were with ideas. They felt like it was critical to kind of not just a kind of first principles of capitalism really needed to be reconstructed for people, rescued from the kind of tarnishing they had experienced during the Great Depression and the New Deal. Crane described himself as a revolutionary for freedom, and he believed that what the American people really needed was a book, a New Testament of capitalism, as he put it, a Bible of free enterprise. And he found in Hayek's work, in books like The Road to Serfdom, a kind of solution, or this was, he thought, the kind of book that the American people needed to read. And so he helped kind of raise money for Hayek over the years because, as he put it, what the highbrows upstairs talk about today has such a decisive influence on the public opinion of tomorrow. That was kind of one sort of area that I looked at, was sort of business conservatives working with these kinds of ideas. I learned about, along the same lines, I learned about companies like General Motors and U.S. Steel, generally thought to have very positive relationships with their unions during this period, giving money to the American Enterprise Association, now the American Enterprise Institute, founded in the mid-40s and kind of which grew over the course of the 1950s. And the American Enterprise Institute saw these sort of business opponents of the New Deal as its major funding base during these years. I learned about men like Roger Milliken, a Yale-educated businessman who owned textile plants in South Carolina and who actually shut down a factory after a union won an election there rather than bargain with the union, who helped National Review grow and survive in its earliest years. William F. Buckley referred to Milliken as the most valuable asset of the magazine. And Milliken also was one of Barry Goldwater's earliest supporters and promoters. So this world of business conservatives, people ardently committed to fighting the New Deal and labor and liberalism, also provided the sort of milieu that politicians like Goldwater and Ronald Reagan emerged out of. People generally know about Reagan's time at General Electric during the 50s, where he went to work after leaving Hollywood when his career kind of stagnated, he had been doing a lounge act in Las Vegas, which he found kind of depressing. But at the company, in addition to hosting its a kind of weekly television program, he would travel from plant to plant around the country, and GE had over 100 plants at the time, speaking to audiences of workers and also to local kind of Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club groups.